今天。Good morning, welcome everyone. Every year, the Center for Academic Research Ethics Education will provide a very important lecture. And this year, we are so honored and happy to have Dr. Susan Garfinkel here to be the guest speaker of this year. Her talk is the best practice for handling research misconduct, guidance from the US regulations. As my request, and also I have the privilege to read her slides before today. So this is the most comprehensive and most informative talk I have ever seen. So there are more than 200 slides for today's talk. So we have 3 parts. The first part is the morning session is more like a procedures, and the afternoon session will be the special circumstances. I translate into the 案例分享, and then we have a short period of Q&A. And let me introduce briefly about Susan. She got her Ph.D. degree in 1991, then majorly worked for the NIH for more than 10 years. Then in 2003, she joined the Office of Research Integrity, ORI, and in the United States Department of Health and Human Services, we call it HHS. So she has a tremendous working experience as government officers in ORI. Last year, and in the last 4 or 5 years, she became the director of the Division of Investigative Oversight. Another division is the education. And last year, she transferred to Ohio State as the assistant vice president for the Office of Research Compliance. So she handled lots of big cases. Okay, that's the part of English. Then I talk in Chinese. Susan is 我认识她很久了哈，她是我们在很多的国际性的这种 research integrity 的会议上认识。那她是我认识里面最乐观、最正直，然后最乐于 help 帮忙人。我记得我第一次在巴西的里约认识他的跟他有进一步深谈的时候，那个早餐会的 table 旁边我说 I don't like your job， 因为你处理的是人性黑暗面哈，都是处理一些 misconduct 的 case。然后他说不，他觉得这是他有他的理由，非常重要。也许我们等一下可以问他哈。然后所以我说我看到他是非常乐观、非常积极进取，而且乐于助人哈。他说乐于助人不仅是维护了学术伦理或我们所谓的研究伦理的这个 integrity， 而且还有这个为了我们整个学术界的一个努力向前的这个力量哈。那我这次也能够邀请他来，真的也花了很多的时间。那我试着大家可以看到他的英文的那些 title， 我们翻的有一点文不对题哈。简单讲就是把它很简化。那各位手上拿到的那个 slides 呢？我放了一些中文，如果那中文翻译的不太对的话，那是我的错哈，是我翻的，就是有一些标题，因为它几乎会谈到所有的问题，包含从美国政府从 ORI 政府的观点，还有下午大部分都是从学校的观点处理一些包含作者的争议或者所谓的自我抄袭，这些不含在ORI 早上所谓的 FAP 的这个定义中，也就是说。美国政府它有非常严格的法律规定，它对于misconduct 有非常有 definition。可是，在实务上，尤其是各大学，一定碰到很多师生之间的关系，老师抄学生的硕士论文，然后或者说这个该挂谁不该挂谁， 好，或者说重复发表等等，这些是 ORI 不处理的，那只有大学会处理，所以我很高兴能够请到他来讲大学端的处理的方法哈。那所以我期待今天会有一个非常丰盛，那希望大家能够 enjoy。那我们这个资源中心现在开始已经如果你对这个资源中心有点理解的话，你就会发现我们现在已经终于把这个网站搬回教育部去了哈，所以它从来就不是交大的网站，它也不是交大的计划，它是教育部计划。然后我们现在证明了，所以它是 Ethics MOE 哈。如果要上这个网站的话，就请上 MOE 这个 edu.tw。OK， 好，因为它的内容非常丰富，所以我们就以热烈掌声 ，Let's welcome Dr. Susan Garfinkel。
So I wish that my Chinese was quite that good, but unfortunately I don't know Chinese, so I will have to speak in English. The talk is going to be in two parts. The part this morning, I will talk, is that okay? I will talk about some of the procedures that are used in the United States and the roles of the people that handle the research misconduct procedures, and a little bit about the investigation process. And then this afternoon, we'll talk more about some of the special circumstances that you encounter as you're dealing with cases of research misconduct. So before we get started, let me say I am just really thrilled to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. Dr. Chow and her staff have treated me like a superstar. I'm not used to this at all, so it's just wonderful to be here and to interact with you. I would like this, because this is a long talk. It'll be 2 hours or 2.5 hours this morning and the same this afternoon. If you can, feel free to ask me. I don't know if you will, but I want to tell you that you can ask me questions as we're going along in the talk if something is relevant to what you've been doing or some experience that you've had. And in the end, we will have some time for questions as well. Okay, so we'll get started. So most of you probably know, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, most of you probably know that the way the United States handles cases of research misconduct is based on a regulation that was written, this particular one was in 2005 by the United States government. The Office of Health and Human Services, the Department of Health and Human Services wrote this regulation that is specific for how you handle cases of research misconduct. And that means how the government handles it, but also how institutions in the United States handle research misconduct when allegations arise. Let me just say that this regulation is specific for the Department of Health and Human Services and the funding from that agency. So there's different funding agencies in the United States. This regulation applies to funding from the National Institutes of Health, which has the biggest amount of funding, particularly in biomedical research. But there is also regulation from the National Science Foundation, which works in a lot of engineering and physics and more of the physical sciences. There's a regulation from the Veterans Affairs, the Department of Veterans Affairs, which handle a lot of human subjects cases. And there are other agencies that are all supposed to have some kind of process in place to handle cases of research misconduct. They just don't get very many cases, so they might have policies, but the people who work in the office don't even know about them because they've never encountered a case. So the ORI, where I used to work before I moved to Ohio State, handles a significant number of cases and has 20 years of experience doing this kind of work. So let me go through just kind of an overview of how the process is handled in the United States. An allegation comes in, and very often it arises at the institution, at a university or a medical center or wherever it is. The responsibility of the institution is to look at the allegation and have procedures in place to handle the allegation. we'll go through some of the specifics of how that's done, but in short, the institution looks at the allegation, conducts an inquiry, which is the initial step in the process, and then conducts the investigation and makes a decision of whether research misconduct occurred. The allegations can also come into the government. So when I worked in the Office of Research Integrity in ORI, the more well-known that office became over the years, the more allegations came directly to ORI. And what happens when that occurs is the institution is the body that is supposed to handle the investigation. So even if the allegation comes into ORI, it still is referred back to the institution to handle its policies. When the case is managed at ORI, there is an initial assessment by a group of scientists who look at these cases from the government perspective. And the case is either, there's different stages where the case can end. So there's an assessment stage. If the allegation is serious and significant, it moves on to an inquiry. If it's not serious and significant, it can end. At the inquiry stage, that's the initial fact-finding stage to see, does this allegation have merit? If it doesn't, it can end. And then it goes on to an investigation. When ORI looks at these cases, I think there was an arrow that was missing in this slide, so let me go back just for a minute. So here, the institution conducts an assessment, an inquiry, and an investigation and makes findings. When the institution decides that an inquiry is going to move on to an investigation, it informs ORI, and ORI conducts its process. The process at ORI is for the federal government. The process at the institution is for the institution to make a finding of whether there's research misconduct. The institution informs ORI throughout the inquiry and investigation and coordinates with ORI. So the government and the institutions work together and really collaborate, but the findings are separate because the actions that an institution takes or ORI takes are different. So an institution might make a finding of research misconduct, and the action that they take might be termination, or it might be supervision, or it might be a reprimand. The action that the government takes is completely different because with a finding of research misconduct, they might put somebody on a supervisory plan, or they might not allow them to receive federal funding anymore. Okay, at the ORI, oh, sorry. If the agency determines that research misconduct occurred, they will try to make findings of research misconduct, and there is a finding. But once a finding is made, the ORI approaches the person who's accused, which is the respondent, and tries to make a settlement with the respondent. So they ask the respondent, will you agree to the findings of research misconduct? This is coming from a government office, so a lot of people say yes. And that finding becomes final with the Assistant Secretary of Health. They review it. So there's another level above ORI that actually reviews the finding, and that's what gets published. ORI does publish its findings. If the respondent chooses not to settle the case, then it goes to a legal system with the attorneys that work for ORI, and the attorneys write what's called a charge letter that lays out every single finding and all the evidence to prove that research misconduct occurred. It could be a 50-page document or a 100-page document, depending on the complexity of the case. The respondent has the right to appeal that finding, but this is all in a legal system because within the Department of Health and Human Services, there's a body called the Department Appeals Board, which are attorneys and judges. So the case is actually reviewed by an administrative law judge. So you have a very complicated process that goes from an institution looking at things from a scientific perspective to the government looking at it from a scientific perspective to the government looking at it from a legal perspective, which is very difficult because you're taking science and trying to put it into the legal context, which is very difficult because when an attorney looks at evidence, they ask you, how do you know that this is true? How do you know that this person did this? And you can't say, I just know. You actually have to have the evidence to prove it. And it's a very hard case to make when you're trying to take a scientific laboratory that works haphazardly and may not document everything that they do. So it really is a lot of work for the people at ORI to actually make findings of research misconduct. Okay, that's the big picture, the overview of how institutions and the government works together. But for this talk, what I'm going to do is focus kind of on the institution's role in this whole process. So why is it in the US that institutions follow this process? I mean, you have very senior people at institutions, presidents, provosts, VPRs, very senior faculty who are very outspoken, as most of you probably know, outspoken about what they believe and how they think things should be. And yet, the institutions will follow these procedures, and the reason is because the institutions have to have an assurance with ORI. That means that if there is an institution that gets money from the federal government, they have to assure to the government that they have policies and procedures in place to deal with allegations of research misconduct, and that the policy has to be consistent and fair and thorough. So the policies and procedures, that means that every institution that gets money from the federal government, particularly from NIH, has an assurance with the Office of Research Integrity where they certify a signed document that says, we do have policies in place. These policies are critical for the university because when a case of research misconduct is being handled, it can be very combative between people. You have different sides who take different approaches, and the policies that the institution works through is what protects the institution as they're going through this procedure. And I'll explain a little bit about that. The policy has to be thorough, competent, objective, and fair. And that's critical to remember. You are the people at the institution who are handling these difficult cases, and you want to be very fair to everybody, to the respondents, the people who are being accused, to the complainants, the people who are raising the complaint. You want to make sure that you're fair to everybody. So I have been at Ohio State for only 10 months. I got there in January. I'm still learning this university. I found that there are a lot of people that I've met here in Taiwan that have connections to Ohio State, which I think is pretty funny. Ohio State are the Buckeyes, if you're interested in the least bit about football. I'm not particularly, and that's like a sin if you go to Ohio State and you're not a big football fan. But somebody told me no matter where you go, you're going to meet a Buckeye, which are the people who go to Ohio State. So I know that some of you are out there because I've already talked to you about this. Anyway, at Ohio State, it's a very big university. There are 60,000 students. There are 7,000 graduate students, I think, and 7,000 faculty. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's a very big university. So Ohio State has a whole web page that's dedicated to policies at the institution. In research, there are 13 different policies. There's an animal care and use program, there's export control, there's a human gene transfer policy, there's research misconduct, there's institutional biosafety. So the institution has written policies to defend the actions that they take for all these different types of things that can happen, and research misconduct is just one of them. So every country has a different way of handling allegations of research misconduct. What I could talk about is what happens in the US. And because there are so many cultural differences between all the different countries, the way the US does it is not going to be adequate or sufficient for every country all around the world. Every country will have to decide what from the US policy, what from the European system you could take and kind of implement in your own culture that's going to work. But what I will do as I go through this talk is talk about the things that should be considered, and that's based on all these years of experience that ORI had and the institutions in the United States handling these procedures. So who handles the allegations of research misconduct? Well, at a US institution, the person is called the RIO, the Research Integrity Officer, and they abbreviate it as RIO. The RIO could be anybody at the institution. The policy, the regulation does not specify who is a RIO. It actually doesn't even use the terminology. This term kind of arose just in handling these many cases. And it could be a director in an office, it could be a vice president level person, it could be a person in HR. There's, depending on the institution and how big it is and what kind of infrastructure they have, the RIO sits in a lot of different places. What I can tell you is because these cases get very difficult to handle, when the RIO has a more senior position at the institution, it's a little easier to deal with because there's a lot of conflict. And a RIO who's in a comfortable place and who doesn't have to feel vulnerable is a good person to deal with these cases that have a lot of conflict. So what does the RIO do? The RIO administers the university policies and assures that the policies are compliant with the federal government rules. And this is what the regulation actually says: fosters a research environment that discourages misconduct. So that's pretty broad. And how you implement this is going to be unique to each university. A federal regulation is only going to be good if it can be implemented differently at different institutions who have different needs, different sizes, different populations of students, different research going on. But that's basically the role of the RIO. The RIO doesn't handle making decisions in the investigation. The RIO handles the process and how the process flows and makes sure it's done fairly and objectively. So whether or not any of the institutions here have a named person as the RIO, it doesn't really matter. When you handle allegations, there are certain things that you should be thinking about and things that you would need to do just to handle it fairly. So in handling the allegations, well, obviously you receive and assess the allegations and determine whether this actually fits the definition of research misconduct. Many RIOs in the United States work with their attorneys at the university who are critical for really explaining whether it's legally possible to do whatever procedure you are talking about doing. The RIOs also prioritize complex allegations, and I'll explain that in a minute, because an allegation doesn't come in simply. They usually come in a whole package of things that are wrong with the way a laboratory is functioning or the way a PI is doing their research. The RIO provides notice to the respondent, so they make sure that the respondent knows exactly what's going on. In the United States and everywhere else, they talk about due process for respondents all the time. You want to make sure that you're not trampling on somebody's rights, because these allegations are very serious. You want to make sure that if allegations are raised against somebody, you're not ruining somebody's reputation if there's no merit to the allegations. The RIOs will work to sequester and safeguard the evidence, and I'll save this for later because sequestering evidence is not something that everybody does. In the United States, it's always done, but outside of the United States, it can be handled differently. They try to protect whistleblowers or the complainants from retaliation. Now, this is not always possible. Retaliation can be very subtle. You can have somebody who is an assistant professor level type person. I remember somebody called our office once and said that he had raised a complaint, and the university, the person that the complaint was about was in a very senior level at the university. And he was actually at the level of the dean. And he said, they're taking away my research space, and they're making my lab, taking away graduate students, and this is all retaliation for raising an allegation. Now, that's difficult to prove, because the dean will come back and say, well, this person hasn't been very productive, and we just decided we need that space. So retaliation is very serious, but it's also very difficult to prove, and you do the best you can. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The RIOs in the United States will keep all the senior level people at an institution informed of the process and communicate with officials in other areas, like in human subjects research, if there are issues of a case that affect another office. There are committees that handle the processes, the investigation and the inquiry, and the RIO will staff them and train them on how to look at research misconduct. Reports have to be written for the institution and also for ORI, because there is a reporting requirement to ORI on the federal level. And the RIOs usually help draft the reports to make sure it has everything in it that the government would need. So they communicate with the agencies. They also handle things that come up in a case that aren't necessarily research misconduct, or defined as research misconduct, but are difficult practices that go on in the laboratory. And they're called questionable research practices or detrimental research practices, QRPs. These are things like authorship problems and mentoring problems and data management problems, all which can have very serious consequences in a laboratory or any research group, but not necessarily research misconduct, which is defined as falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. So I put this slide in because I think that anybody who handles these cases, everybody is looking for specific written processes. In this case, this is what you do. And the fact is, with a research misconduct case, that is not the way it works. There are certain regulations and policies that you must follow, but implementing those policies can be very different depending on the case. And a RIO, a person who handles these cases, really has to have a certain level of discretion to be able to make a decision about what to do in a case that there is nothing written down. In this case, you will do it this way. That's just not the way it works. The way it works is that as you gain more and more experience, you realize what the consequences are from your decisions, and you make decisions based on your past experience and the experience of others. So in the United States, what has happened is that there's an association that has sprung up. There's one in Europe, there's one in the Asia-Pacific region. There's a group that's trying to get together where people who work in research integrity and research misconduct get together and meet so that they could talk to each other and say, how did you handle this situation, and how did you handle this situation? Because although there is a regulation, it's not very specific for how you handle each part of every case. And I think most importantly, you have to be have empathy and be courteous and firm, because sometimes respondents will yell at you. Keep a sense of humor about it. You know, it's very demoralizing to be in a situation where you feel like you're being attacked from the people raising the concern, and from the people who are accused, and from the administration that's coming this way, and from the press coming this way. And I think that you have to be self-confident, but actually really keep your sense of you're doing the right thing. You're working towards the right goal, and just smile and be kind. Okay, as I said, there are many challenges. You have complainants who are can be very difficult. They are raising an allegation, believing in their heart that this allegation is real, and maybe it's not research misconduct, maybe it's something else. So you tell them, well, this doesn't really fit in the jurisdiction of ORI or in the jurisdiction of our office, and they say, well, it should. So they keep coming at you. And there's nothing you can do other than just say, you need to do this, you need to go to this office, you need to talk to this. You know, you can't argue with people because when they're firm in their belief, they're just gonna argue back and they're not gonna listen to you anyway. In the United States, it's getting particularly difficult because everybody gets an attorney. So respondents have attorneys, complainants have attorneys, committee members sometimes get attorneys. And when you get attorneys involved, although they can be very helpful sometimes they just obstruct the process even more. So it's a little difficult. Obviously, there could be retaliation, and as I said, it's so hard to see it and to figure it out. It's like any kind of prejudice. Sometimes you know it's there, but how do you prove it? How do you prove that somebody's acting badly because they feel that way? And retaliation is difficult. There are bad faith allegations or malicious allegations that are used as a tool to kind of attack somebody. I used to say that when I was at ORI, I had never seen a bad faith allegation, and I'll talk a little about this later. Because bad faith means that the complainant is raising an allegation that they know not to be true. And the fact is, most complainants believe it. They believe, no matter what they're telling you, how ridiculous it might sound, they actually believe that this is true. So that's not a bad faith allegation. That's just somebody who really believes this to be true, whether it is or not. And so I always thought, well, people talk about bad faith allegations, but I've never seen one until I did. And the way it came about is that it was an anonymous allegation that there was a piece of paper mailed to the ORI. So I open up the envelope, and it's a handwritten note about, I don't know, there must have been about 6 or 7 different allegations about a laboratory in a university in the US. And the next day I got another one with another 6 allegations. So we contacted the university and we said, well, you know, do you know about this? And the Rio who worked there said, yes, actually we do. We got the same notes and we've been handling this. They just sent it to you. We got it probably 2 or 3 weeks after the university got it. I guess the complainant thought somebody other than the university has to be dealing with this because, as you know, the processes are very confidential, so they didn't know what was going on, so they contacted ORI. Anyway, the institution looked at them, and there were many, and all of the data was there. All of the work was done. All of it fit the published version of what was going on. And the Rio wrote the reports and followed the procedures and sent it to ORI. And as the whole process was going on this way, another letter comes. The same laboratory was being attacked, another full set of allegations. And the Rio calls me and says, what do I do with this? Now, this is a great example that there are no rules written down for how to handle this. You have to use common sense. If you looked at 16 or 18 allegations already and none of them had any merit and you could dismiss them all, why would you go look at 8 more? This seemed to me like a bad faith allegation. And I told the Rio, I don't believe that you have to go look at this any more than you have because this looks like a bad faith allegation. So I actually finally found one of what I thought was a bad faith allegation. Usually it's not like that. Usually people raise the allegation and they believe it and you have to look at it. Sometimes the people who are handling the case have a conflict, especially senior people, and it's really important to know that anybody who's working in an institution who has a conflict needs to be recused from this process. And of course, the university has to support you. So we recently had a meeting at Ohio State, and one of the sessions at the meeting were with senior vice presidents for research. They came to sit on a panel to talk about what's going on in their university and their commitment that this university is going to have a culture that has integrity in research. That's a big statement to make, a bold statement, but if you don't have the support of the leadership at the university, it's going to be really hard to train students and postdocs and junior faculty, because they're going to move on to another university, and what happens if the leadership is not committed to this whole culture that you want to develop? Okay, I'm going to just take a drink of water for a minute. Sorry. So what happens when you receive an allegation? How do you go about looking at it? From the perspective of the government, in 42 CFR Part 93 is the federal regulation. It requires that institutions notify ORI if certain conditions exist. And I'm showing you this because these are conditions that are serious, that an institution has to notify the government when an allegation is raised with these kinds of issues. But it also is something that the people at the institution have to think about in how do I handle all of this, okay? So the first is the health or safety of the public is at risk. Usually that's with allegations that involve clinical research and some kind of clinical trial and a human subject is involved. If the government resources are at risk or threatened, so if there's a lot of dollars, federal dollars involved, if research activities are going to be suspended, also mostly this is relevant to human subject studies, and if there's any kind of violation where there's any kind of criminal activity that went on. So there was one case where it was a human subject study, and there was a patient that died, and whether or not it was because of bad treatment, we didn't know, but there was a patient who died, which is going to be very serious, and you know, if something like that came in, you would notify the federal office immediately. And also, the government wants to be involved if they know that there's going to be a lot of publicity surrounding a case. Sometimes you don't know, but if you do know that there's publicity, then the government doesn't want to be blindsided with all this press without knowing what the situation is and what's going on. So I say that, you know, research projects are bigger and more complex than ever, and there can be cases that come in with an allegation of research misconduct that involve human subjects research. It might have financial conflict of interest and radiation safety issues, violation of criminal law, all the things that I've kind of discussed. So what do you do, and how do you handle that, and in what order do you do things? In general, the recommendation is that the person who handles research misconduct should have the authority to stop the research misconduct proceedings to deal with other things that are critical. So if a human subject study is involved, research misconduct is probably not going to be as important as making sure patients are safe. So a person handling allegations should have the authority to say, okay, we're going to stop this process in order to handle these other issues. I had a Rio once that talked about a case where there were some biological reagents that were biosafety issues. They were dangerous agents like viruses or something. And when an allegation was raised, the PI or the assistant professor in the laboratory was trying to take everything out of the lab and put it in the car and go home with it because they didn't want people to find it, and it wound up that the FBI was actually called in to deal with this because this was a biosafety issue that was very serious. So obviously, research misconduct is not as serious as that. I had one case, this was almost I couldn't get over this one. It was public because it was in the newspaper, and there was a person who had allegations of research misconduct raised against him, but at the same time, he killed his wife. He poisoned her. Obviously not associated with the research misconduct, but he did kill his wife. And he was found to have done that because they wound up finding a tablet that he had, and he had ordered some cyanide, and that's what he had been giving his wife. So this guy was in jail waiting a trial, and the Rio calls me and says there's allegations of research misconduct raised against him, and I said, but he's in jail. So, you know, is he really going to be worried about research misconduct while he's waiting to see if he's going to be guilty of murder? And the Rio was pretty funny because he says, well, I think we can handle this case. He has plenty of time to respond to us. So they actually did, which I was amazed. I said, well, you know, if you want to do that, okay. And he sent him documentation while he was in jail waiting for his trial. In the end, when the whole thing was done, there was a finding of research misconduct, but ORI was not going to take the resources to manage a case like that when the guy, he was found guilty of committing murder. So he's already in jail, and it just didn't make sense for us to add on to that because he was already in a situation where he's not going to be a threat to the public health service. So anyway, so you have to think about all these things that kind of come up in cases. And while the Rio or the person handling allegations should have the authority to put research misconduct aside, they also have to have the authority to handle research misconduct above other things. So if there's a case with issues of authorship or mentorship, that is serious and may have implications for the people in the laboratory, but the research misconduct should take a priority over those kinds of issues. There's also criminal, as I described, civil litigation lawsuits, collaborations at other institutions. How do you handle all that? There's nothing written down anywhere in the US regulation or in institutional policies usually. How do we handle allegations that involve somebody that's in 3 different institutions? Over, several years, they move to all these different institutions. Another example of how the person handling this has to use discretion of what you think is the right way to deal with these kinds of cases. I'm going to go through these things relatively quickly because everybody will do it a little bit differently. The biggest point here is that as you handle these cases, everything should be documented. Everything should be justified. Everything that you do, there should be a trail of it so you don't forget what you did, but also justify every decision you make, because in the end, when somebody comes back to you and questions you, which they will do, the press does it, the institutional officials do it, it comes from all different places. ORI would have requests from congressional members, state senators or congressmen who would say, a constituent called me and said that ORI isn't handling these cases, and why is that? And we have to go look through all the records to make sure that we handle things correctly. And when things are justified, it's easy to do that. So there's kind of like an SOP, a standard operating procedure for handling allegations of research misconduct. It's document everything, make logs, do intakes for conversations with complainants and respondents. If somebody comes to you, really make sure you know exactly what they're talking about and document it. Prepare for interviews and recordings. In the US, in every case of research misconduct, the respondent and complainant are interviewed. I know here that's not the case, but if you don't interview in person, you interview with written questions, and you still have to be able to document the questions and the focus of the questions. The US usually has a team of people that you can deal with, because you never know how these cases are going to come out in the end. You never know what kind of issues you're going to find. So the ORI would always recommend that you have an attorney who could help you if there are legal problems. if you're not a scientist and you don't understand what the allegation is all about, you need a subject matter expert who can help you understand that. You might have to engage the public affairs office because some cases are very public. So you want to make sure that the institution's reputation is upheld, and you engage public affairs who will communicate with the press. And if there are issues of security, which it does happen. There was some very tragic cases in the US. One in particular, it was a complainant who didn't like the way things went and found out where the vice president for research, who was the ultimate deciding official, lived outside of New York. It was upstate New York. It's public, so I'm not giving away anything. And he went and he tried to shoot him. He did shoot him, but the guy survived. Everything was okay. But that's traumatic. I mean, there's an incredible risk with some of these people because they are in a mental state that has really affected everything that they do. So there are issues of security. You know, you have to think about what allegations look like when you're receiving an allegation, because usually a complainant is pretty distraught and upset, and they don't come to a research integrity office or any office of compliance and say, well, my PI falsified a figure 7 in a paper. They say, my PI lies all the time and he just doesn't do anything correctly, and it's vague, it's not specific, and you have to listen and really try to parse out what is real, what are they actually trying to tell you is either falsified, fabricated, or plagiarized. Allegations can reach a RIO in many different ways, in person, by telephone. In ORI, your anonymous allegations are allowed. Very often, institutions have a hotline where they allow people to write in electronically and keep their identity secret. The RIO might know who the person is, but they will never reveal it. This is because the belief is that people put themselves in a very vulnerable situation when they're raising an allegation, and they want them to have the freedom to raise it without being fearful that they're going to be retaliated against. The reality is, if you work in a place where you've already complained about some of the practices that are going on, people are going to know who raised the allegation anyway. But you can make it anonymously. Obviously, a lot of public allegations are made anonymously. They're made on a website through PubPeer or through Retraction Watch or through many different places. And public allegations are a whole different beast. So back in 2005, when I had just started working with ORI, there was a case that was handled at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a scientific journal, well, the New Scientist, it's kind of like a magazine, a science magazine, published the institutional findings, the results of an investigation. And everybody was really surprised that this was actually published. In 2007, most of you, I'm sure, know about the Korean stem cell research case that was very public, and the results weren't made public, the whole investigation was made public. What was going on during the case and how it was being investigated, everything was publicized. At the same time, there was another case where this also involved stem cell research. The allegations were made public. And at that time, in 2007, nobody could believe that anybody would make public an allegation when the institution hadn't looked into it at all. But now we know that they do it all the time. There's PubPeer, there's Retraction Watch, there's Claire Francis. Do you know Claire Francis? Have you heard this? Claire Francis was an anonymous person who would scan the literature and look at Western blots. Is mostly biomedical science in here, or no? Everybody's from different fields. But anyway, Western blot is the scientific data with bands on it. And Claire Francis would scan the Western blots and then find manipulated images and send it to the university and send it to ORI. In fact, in 2012, there was a weekend where the person who was the director of the division before I got to be the director got email from Claire Francis, because our email addresses and ORI were all public, got email from Claire Francis in probably 10 different emails, and each email was about 50 allegations for a specific laboratory with all the papers they had published. Some of them were, it didn't seem to us that this person actually had a scientific background because they just raised allegations that didn't make any sense. But some of them actually had merit, and we had to deal with them. So every Rio in the United States, when you mention the name Claire Francis, you hear, there's like a big sigh because everybody has had to deal with this. That set of allegations closed ORI, basically closed ORI down for like 2 weeks while we tried to get through all those allegations. So there's Claire Francis. There's all kinds of articles about misconduct in the science press. And while I thought that was bad, it's the public press that makes us crazy, because the public press goes out to everybody. And the people who write about research misconduct in the lay papers and magazines don't really understand the process. So they take what looks like the institution is trying to obstruct this whole matter. And really, that's not true. The institution is doing as best as they can with the circumstances around this case. And anybody who has been in a research misconduct case understands that. And there's really nothing you can do. You just kind of say, Ohio State has been in the press on the front page of the New York Times, fortunately before I was there. But it still is really difficult because it tarnishes the reputation of an otherwise stellar institution, or it tarnishes the reputation of a respondent. So these public documents and all of the publicity around these cases are making things even more difficult in a situation that's difficult to start out with. But despite that, these allegations have to be handled exactly as you would handle any other allegation. You don't have a complainant that you could talk to because it might be anonymous, but it is an allegation that you should look at and take it seriously. And we did that at ORI with the Claire Francis allegations. We looked at every one of those allegations. The director of the office actually said, you do this many, you do this many. He parsed it out to everybody in the office to make sure that we looked at it carefully and decided what to do with them. So the SOP was something that came from a training session that ORI did. And it's just something to think about if you are the person who accepts allegations at an institution. These are just some of the things to think about. Who's making the allegation, the complainant, referred by a person other than the complainant? Is it anonymous, in writing? Is it oral? And just keep a record of this. What is the allegation? I told you that it comes in very vague, so really specify what is the allegation. Is it falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism? Is it published data, or is it just data that's in the lab somewhere? Who's the respondent? Do they have collaborations in research? Are there collaborators at other institutions? If the allegation is made publicly, you may not be able to name a respondent. And this is particularly difficult when you get allegations that come in anonymously from like the PubPeer website, because they'll talk about 15 different images in papers that you don't know who's responsible. You know the PI of the laboratory, but it could be any one of 15 people that have worked in that laboratory over the years that could be responsible for it, and you just don't know. Where and when did the misconduct occur? In general, also not written into the regulation, but in general, an allegation is handled by the university where the misconduct occurred. So if a PI goes from institution A to B to C, and the allegations occurred, the misconduct occurred at institution B, that's generally where that's the institution that accepts responsibility for looking at the allegations. However, this is where a RIO or somebody handling the allegations needs to have discretion. If the PI has moved to all these different institutions, and institution C is where that person is with all the data, with all of the information, why would you send it back to institution B? Maybe institution C is the best person to deal with it. And the way that it has worked out, it can be very different. Basically, what ORI would tell institutional officials is to do the investigation in a way that makes the most sense. And the RIOs will coordinate it and collaborate together with the so that different institutions know exactly what's going on. Is there evidence? Does the complainant have any evidence to support the allegation? That's always good to know. Do other people have any evidence? And then think about if a complainant comes in, how would you get back in touch with this person if you needed to, or make sure that they understand issues of retaliation that they might not even be aware of, and just be very fair. Think about whether the complaints are being made in good faith. As I said, usually I think they are. Discuss confidentiality and the need for people who raise allegations not to talk about this with anybody, because you don't want to ruin reputations if there's nothing there. Allow a complainant to, we encourage RIOs to allow complainants to contact them, because there might be more information that they didn't share the first time they spoke to the person. And although this seems like a lot of detail and a lot of care and caution, I have to tell you that it really is in the very beginning of a case when things go bad. If you don't handle the beginning correctly, things could really go badly quickly. And one person, David Wright, who was a former ORI director, he said that somebody, I think his grandmother used to say, after you drive off the cliff, your options narrow. So you make sure you do it right so you don't go flying off the cliff and you have no other choice. So you received allegations, and I'll ask if anybody has any questions right now, because I've been talking for an hour, so. Okay, we'll just go on. So after you receive the allegation, you have to do something with it, and that's assessing the allegation. In the federal regulation, the first step is to determine if the allegation fits the definition of research misconduct, which means falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, abbreviated as FFP. And is it sufficiently credible and specific so that you can actually find information? I mean, basically, you want to know what they're claiming is falsified or fabricated. It's a very low bar in the assessment phase to move forward. As long as you know that it fits the definition and it's credible and specific, you don't have to know any more under the US guidelines to move it forward to an inquiry. At Ohio State, the assessment is done by the RIO, and it's in coordination with the dean of the college where the respondent exists. So, as you can imagine, very senior faculty, and actually all faculty, don't like administrators telling them this is what you have to do. And they tend to listen to a dean before they'll listen to somebody in research administration. In Ohio State, the RIO works with the dean to deal with the whole process. At the assessment stage, every institution does it a little bit differently. Some assessments are very quick, and some are a little bit longer to make sure that they have all the information you need. At Ohio State, they actually do a little bit more work up front to make sure that moving forward really is necessary. So they'll look at the allegation and determine whether they need to get any other information from others at the university or from people outside of the university. Going outside of the university usually requires the permission of the deciding official. At OSU, it is the senior vice president for research, because once you can go outside and look for information without really letting that person know too much about why you're asking, but you're the RIO, so they know that something is going on when you go outside. We try to figure out, does anyone other than the complainant need to be contacted? Sometimes you have to talk to the respondent to really figure out what's going on, and we will do that in the office. We sometimes will talk to the respondent and notify them that the allegations were made, and we need information from them to tell us, is there any merit to this allegation? And of course, think about if there are special circumstances like I described with human subjects or biosafety issues or any other kind of issue that's going on. The RIO and the dean write what they call an assessment report. It's a pretty detailed document that documents exactly what was done and what each person told the RIO, or what the RIO did for different situations. And talks about the circumstances that gave rise to the allegation. Allegations that fail to indicate research misconduct are dismissed, and allegations that look like research misconduct move forward to an inquiry. Here too, the complications are that the allegation might be reported to somebody else in the university. It might be that the RIO never sees the allegations and everybody else in the university has seen them, and the allegations really aren't assessed properly. It might get handled by somebody else, usually the complainant. I remember there was a case where there was a graduate student in a lab, and the PI identified that something was wrong, and the PI said, "You are out. Get out of the lab. I don't want to see you anymore. Take your stuff and leave." And he let the student go back into the lab and gather up his stuff and leave. And when they actually wanted to go look for the data, most of the data was gone because the student had taken everything that was damaging to him. So that obviously gets in the way of an allegation. The general guidance for faculty at the university is to contact the person at the university who handles these things, because they know what the process is and how you're supposed to do things. And then when special circumstances are not handled properly, everybody has issues with that. It usually affects high levels at the institution, and you just want to try to avoid those kind of problems. We've talked about retaliation and making sure you talk to the complainant properly. Rumors circulate. You can't stop it. It's just the way it is. Human nature is to gossip about things that are bad and bad things that happen. You try to ensure that you tell people this is a confidential process. You cannot talk about it. Surprisingly, a lot of faculty will honor that, but at the level of students and postdocs, everybody talks to their peers, because they are not talking to people above them. They're just talking within their group for support. And you want to try to tell people not to do that, but it happens all the time. And rumors they have a life of their own, it seems like. They grow, and before you know it, everybody is talking about something. And then bad faith allegations we've talked about a little bit. That is a problem. So bad faith allegations are a little bit difficult because the regulations don't actually define what a bad faith allegation is. They define what a good faith allegation is, okay? Which is kind of a little weird, but that's what they say. A good faith allegation is defined like this. As applied to a complainant or a witness, it means having a belief in the truth of one's allegation or testimony that a reasonable person in the complainant's or witness's position could have based on the information known to the complainant or witness at the time. So that last little bit there, based on the information known to the complainant or witness at the time, is the idea of people raising allegations in good faith that might not turn out to be research misconduct, but based on what they knew, they believe that this is research misconduct. So that's the definition of good faith. So if you turn that around, you can come up with, well, actually, I'm sorry. This is also defined in the regulation as an allegation or cooperation with a research misconduct proceeding is not in good faith if it's made with knowing or reckless disregard for information that would negate the allegation or testimony. So if you look at how good faith is described in the regulation, okay, you actually could define a bad faith allegation. And this is a definition of bad faith that is the reverse of good faith. So a bad faith complainants are those who do not have a belief in the truth of their allegation that a reasonable person in the complainant's position could have based on the information known to the complainant at the time, and acts with knowing or reckless disregard for the information that would negate the allegation. And this is actually the definition that's used at Ohio State, something very similar to this. So although you don't have the government telling you what bad faith looks like, you look at what good faith means and you could figure out what bad faith means. And that's the best I could do with a bad faith allegation. You just have to use common sense to figure out whether somebody actually has a belief in what they're saying. And that's the problem. How do you know? As I said, most complainants believe in the merit of their allegations. An allegation can lack credibility or specificity, but it still might not be a bad faith allegation. The complainant believes it to be true. And institutions can have procedures for addressing bad faith allegations. If you have a procedure, it should be fair in trying to determine whether it's bad faith. Recommendations for institutional policies and practice. If you have a policy that you could specify what bad faith is, the individuals who handle these cases should have the authority and responsibility to look into whether an allegation is made in bad faith, because they're the ones that would be reasonably be able to make that determination. A research misconduct policy that specifies if the complainants and witnesses and committee members are acting in good faith helps the RIO or the person handling the allegations to actually say, well, here in our policy, this is how we define it and this is what we do. And also have conditions for what you would do with a bad faith allegation. I would say most institutions in the United States do not have this. But if you're faced with a bad faith allegation, what are you going to do with the person who's making the bad faith allegation? So at Ohio State, they call it frivolous allegations, which is basically bad faith allegations. And the way it's defined is those allegations that are made in bad faith or with malice are unsupported by credible evidence and which are found to be without merit. Allegations of research misconduct are serious and should be supported by sufficient credible evidence. And filing frivolous allegations is this is directly from the OSU policy. Filing frivolous allegations is an abuse of procedures set forth in this policy and may result in disciplinary action under other university rules or procedures. So I was asked, what does that mean? What kind of disciplinary action? And hold on one second. So what could an institution do? What can you do to somebody who makes a bad faith allegation? And basically, the way Ohio State looks at it, it is exactly what is listed in the policy under some of the mitigating factors for when a respondent the respondent's behavior in a research misconduct case and the action you take against a respondent has the same set of things that you look at. So let me tell you what they are. You would look at making disciplinary action would depend on the nature of the violation, the involvement of the complainant and how involved they were in this bad faith allegation, the harm that it caused, the impact on the community, the severity, the respondent's understanding and remorse, the complainant, the person who raised the allegation, did they, is this disciplinary action, did they apologize and say, oh, I'm sorry, I did something like that, and their cooperation and compliance. So disciplinary action, for anything that happens to anybody, there's a set of rules that you would look at for what kind of action you would take. It would be exactly the same with a bad faith allegation. It's serious. It's a harm to somebody's reputation, and the university can look at the same set of norms that you would look for any policy violation in an institution and apply it to a bad faith allegation. And the disciplinary action can be a formal reprimand. It could be a probationary warning period where you are under probation for a certain period of time, and if any kind of violation happens during that time period, then there will be more severe action. It could be suspension from the university for a specific period of time, and then you're allowed to come back, or it could be just a full-out termination. So any kind of situation that requires disciplinary action would be the same for bad faith allegations or other breaches in university policy. Okay. Does anybody want to keep going, or do you want to take a 5-minute break, or keep going? Keep going? Okay, we have a little while. So then we get to, okay. We get to the notification of the respondent. So the regulation, the federal regulation, says that the person handling a case has to make a good faith effort to notify in writing the presumed respondent. And that is the way all universities handle it. I don't know of any university that I've worked with that hasn't notified the respondent in writing that there was a problem, because that's the first step, your initial interaction with the respondent. It's very important to set the right tone if you actually do talk to the respondent. Now, I know here it's a little bit different in the way cases are handled, but the assumption is that at some point you might talk to the respondent, so I'm going to go through some of this. You provide a written statement. Usually it's a good idea to provide the policies and procedures that the university follows, because the respondent might not be aware of what they are. Explain the rights of the respondent. You have certain rights that you can have counsel with you if you come to an interview, what it means to have an allegation filed against you and what the consequences are. Obviously explain the need for confidentiality, avoiding retaliation. These are big things. Set the tone that's right, be respectful. You usually have much better success with these cases when a respondent is cooperative and can help you identify data, give you data that you need. Respondents who, I don't want to make a generalization, but respondents who have something to hide tend to be more obstructive. Obviously, they don't want you to find it. Stabilize the situation, ensure that the respondent's rights are protected, identify key issues that may be discussed during an interview, if there is an interview. So what happens if a respondent makes an admission of research misconduct? Obviously record the admission. I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later this afternoon, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on an admission statement now. If the respondent declares innocence but can't offer any evidence to support the innocence, review the allegation in detail and ask the respondent for data, obviously, and then in the United States, this is the critical point of an investigation, and that is to sequester data. If you don't have data to look at to make a determination of whether research misconduct occurred, you're not going to be able to make that determination because you have no data to go back to. So this is a very big step in the United States. It's very difficult. You're walking into somebody's laboratory. The RIO comes in with a staff of people and usually asks the respondent to give the data to support the allegation, and they're overwhelmed and angry and they don't want to give it to you, and you just have to work with them in a very gentle way to tell them that this is the way it has to be done. In the United States, the data does not belong to the respondent, it belongs to the institution, because a grant is made to the institution and the institution holds the money and allows the PI to actually be the steward of the data. But it actually belongs to the institution. So if a respondent argues and says, you're not going to take this data, this is mine, actually legally that's not true. So that's how the United States has the authority to actually go in and say we want the data. Now, things get very complicated because nowadays everything isn't written down on paper, and there's electronic data and cloud storage and personal laptops and tablets and everywhere. So it's a very complicated situation, and it's getting more complicated now. I think I'll talk about sequestration later. During the investigation, it's the focus of what the institution does, not what ORI does. So the allegation stage is to just determine whether the allegation fits the research misconduct definition and is specific and credible. If it is, it moves to an inquiry, and the inquiry is the preliminary fact-finding and information gathering that indicates if the allegation has substance. In other words, somebody raises an allegation that you falsified an image, and you look at the image and you say, there is some manipulation here, what happened? And the person can't provide you with any data to say, well, here's the experiment. I did the experiment, this is what it looks like. I don't know what you're looking at in this image because this is what it looks like. And you say, okay, well, you had the data. So if that's true, it doesn't move forward. If they can't provide data, then it moves to an investigation. And the investigation is when the committee, a panel actually looks very carefully at the data to make a determination about whether research misconduct occurred and recommends what kind of actions or sanctions should be taken. And this is a process that occurs at all universities throughout the United States, dictated by the federal policy. In knowing how difficult these processes are, I'm sure whoever wrote the federal regulation, it was attorneys, they realized that you have to ensure that the process is going to be handled fairly. And that is a big component of handling these. The investigation has to be impartial and unbiased. And one of the key roles as a person who works in the RIO's office is to make sure that you remain unbiased. And I have to tell you, sometimes it's really hard because you have a case, you know that person is guilty, you know it as sure as you're standing here that that person is guilty, and you still have to handle the case with no, very objectively, with no bias. You cannot influence the committee. The RIO does not, the RIO handles the case administratively. It does not make a decision about whether research misconduct occurred or not. You just aid the investigation committee in making that decision. So there are certain things to think about during an investigation. So here, you might not have a RIO who manages the case for you, but you might have a set of a staff, an administrative staff who helps the committee. And the committee really needs to be, to ensure that there's a fair investigation that goes on. The panel should have the required expertise to deal with the subject matter. So I remember once we had a case where there was it was a case in animal science, and the university had a standing committee. Actually, I think I have a slide about this later on. But the background of the committee was totally unrelated to the science that was being looked at. And that doesn't make any sense because they can't make any kind of assessment about whether misconduct occurred if you don't understand what the science is all about. The panelists should be in a position, usually in the United States, it's a tenure track position where they have tenure, so they can't be retaliated against. So they're usually senior people that sit on the investigation committees. This is good and bad. They're senior, they're smart, they have a lot of experience, they have security in their job, but they have a million responsibilities. So trying to get 3 or 5 people to find one day where they could all sit in the room and handle this case and talk about it is incredibly difficult. Sometimes it takes you 3 or 4 weeks just to find one day that everybody could meet. So it's good and bad that you have these people who can handle the process. There's just not a lot of time for them. So people who are in vulnerable positions, they can sit on a committee, but you just have to be careful and make sure that they are safe from any kind of problems that can occur. Oh, here's what I was talking about. So here's the slide. This is the allegations in environmental and animal science. So the committee was a professor of physics and sociology and civil engineering and law, biology, and music. And how do you make an assessment about whether research misconduct occurred in animal science when you're a professor of music? So generally, when these standing committees are in an institution, it's to handle the administrative action or the sanction that occurs and not to actually review the data. A committee like this would be perfectly fine to say, well, this person was found guilty of committing research misconduct, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to take this kind of action because they have the long-term experience with dealing with these cases. So they could make that decision pretty easily. But to actually rule on the science is kind of inappropriate. In this case, the standing committee recommended not to move to an investigation. And ultimately, an ad hoc committee with the appropriate expertise looked at the data. What happens in this case is that you have no analysis. This case came to ORI, and there was no analysis of the data. So how do you make a decision if you never analyze the data? In order to be fair, you have to ensure there are no conflicts of interest of anybody who's involved in the process. At Ohio State, if there is a conflict, a superior person assigns somebody else to deal with it. A good thing is to make sure that the allegations are clear to everybody who's on the panel. The institution's policies and procedures are reviewed for everybody on the panel so they know what they're supposed to be doing. The RIO and usually legal counsel will provide support to committees throughout the process and make sure that they understand what they're looking at and what they're doing. They review the criteria for determining whether an investigation is warranted or whether misconduct occurred. People who are not skilled in handling research misconduct really don't know all the little nuances and details about what is required to make a finding of research misconduct. So the RIO's office or somebody who's handling these kinds of cases can be very useful to help the committee say, well, this is what we should be thinking about and what we want to do. It's really important to be very systematic. When you have a case that has 20 papers involved and maybe 50 allegations, that could go out of control very quickly. And there are cases like that. There are many cases like that. When I was at ORI, I saw many cases where there were huge numbers of allegations, and you have to be very systematic. You have to look at the evidence for each one of those allegations. You can't just make global statements that misconduct occurred because there's a problem in 5 figures, so it must be bad. It has to be very specific. I'm not going to talk. The communications with the panels, the investigation panels, and the respondent or complainant goes through the RIO's office. And that's to ensure that everybody gets the same information. When you're doing an investigation, everybody gets the same information, and nobody has any access to a specific person without the RIO's office, who is supposed to be the biased part, the unbiased part, actually looking at all of the information that's supplied to the committee. So as I explained, there's three processes. There's the assessment, the inquiry, and the investigation. The investigation body will look at everything that was done previously during the assessment and the inquiry. They'll look at all existing data. They'll look to determine whether specific expertise is required. You know, sometimes you have these cases in chemistry or physics, and you really need very specific expertise on a specific subject. Should other allegations or respondents be added? That's always a big question. Who is the person who is responsible for this? And the conclusions, of course, have to be justified. So if you make a finding that research misconduct occurred, you have to carefully justify why you came to that decision. So I had a case that came into ORI, and it was a case about research that tested the effectiveness of a drug using a flow cytometry or FACS analysis. It's just a technique to look at the effect on cells. The respondent admitted that there were errors, honest errors. Now, honest error is not part of the definition of research misconduct. It's an honest error. And that the respondent understood that what the accepted practices were for this specific technology. So as I was sitting at my desk reading the report, these are the things that I read in the report. That the respondent had significant experience with FACS analysis, but all of the errors that were made, what the respondent claimed were errors, supported the hypothesis. So that's the first kind of suspicion, that if everything is an error, how come everything goes in favor of the hypothesis of the respondent? The committee had asked the respondent to reanalyze the data, and in the reanalysis, in order to get to the same conclusions, there were also errors. And I thought, well, that's also very suspicious, because you're helping to understand how you got there. The committee asks you to reanalyze it, and you have more errors. And so I'm reading it thinking, oh, I see where this is going. The committee determined that there may have been intentional errors to mislead the committee. And I thought, well, that's pretty serious. They said that there was significant discrepancies between the respondent's testimony and the record, that the respondent had no explanations for the loss of original data, and that the conclusions that the respondent reached had no foundation. So if you're sitting in an objective office reading this, you're thinking, well, it looks like this is a case of research misconduct. But the committee concluded that the respondent's behavior reflects numerous errors in judgment, negligence, self-deception, or scientific incompetence, but not research misconduct. And that made no sense to me, because everything that I read up until the last paragraph of the report, which said this, looked like the respondent had done everything intentionally to get the result that she had wanted. And I went, you gotta be kidding me. What does this mean? And I went back to the institution, and I asked the people, I actually spoke to somebody on the committee, which usually you go through the RIO's office. From the government side, you would work through the RIO's office. But we actually talked to people and said, you have to explain why this was your conclusion. And in fact, the committee came to that conclusion for very valid reasons. They just didn't put it into the report. So when you write a report and when you're thinking about it, you know what you're thinking as a person on a committee, but somebody reading the report would not know it. So it's important to make sure you justify the conclusions that are reached. Okay, hold on one second. I'm sorry? Oh, what was the reason they had that conclusion? It actually doesn't sound very good, but they said the respondent was so incompetent and really just didn't understand how these data should be handled and manipulated, that they really believed that it was errors. And when they actually showed me some of the things that had been done, their expertise, they believed that she was just really incompetent and it was errors. It wasn't intentionally misleading them. So, okay, I just want to see where I am. So, I think maybe I'm not going to talk that much about interviews because here, the way the system works, you don't interview people. And you have a lot of this in the handout that was provided with what people in the U.S. would think about and what they would do if they were looking to interview somebody. But what I will talk about is, just for a minute, okay, so the way the process works in the U.S., the institutions handle the procedures, and included in the procedure is interviewing the respondent and the complainant. And the interviews are transcribed, so you have a written documentation of what the interview said, and all of that is sent to ORI so that ORI could make the ultimate decision for the government based on the evidence. And the interviews are part of the evidence that ORI will look at. So every transcript is reviewed by the scientist at ORI who is handling the case. And in general, it's kind of unfortunate that interviews are handled by a panel of scientists who don't really have the skills at interviewing people. If they were a panel of lawyers, they might do it better because an attorney knows how to ask a pointed question to get to an answer. But a scientist is a different type of person who is not skilled in these interviewing techniques. But that's the system that we deal with. So whether you interview in person or you actually write questions for the respondent to answer, the question should be very specific and designed to get the answer that you're looking for. And when you have an in-person interview, these are some of the things that, this was actually taken from a real interview when the committee was getting to they gave the respondent the data to look at and said, what happened here? It was a Western blot, so it was a film that they had given the respondent. And this was what ORI saw to try to make sense out of what they were saying. So the committee member, the person on the committee said, so you think the story may be correct? And the respondent said, so you look at this and you look at this and you can see certain things here that are similar, like this spot here and these spots here. They match on this side, but it doesn't match on the other side. But if you simply superimpose this one, half of this one, on half of this one, that's how you generate this new band, which is astonishing. So they were actually talking about a Western blot and creating a new band. I figured out eventually what they were talking about. But when you read this with no context, it's taken out of context because you're not sitting in the interview, you realize how poorly these interviews are conducted because they are not specifying what piece of data you're looking at. They're not specifying for the person recording the interview what you're actually talking about. So interviews can be very helpful or they could be not helpful at all depending on how well they're conducted. And if you prepare in advance, you generally can find ways to make the interviews more informative. But I will give you this one example, and this is actually based on a true story. It was a case that was handled in the United States. It was public. It was it was written about in the paper. And I will just go through this. This is a case where there was a professor who was conducting studies on alcohol and drug addiction with clinical interventions. And the allegation arose about the number of enrolled studies a number of enrolled subjects in the studies that the person was reporting in progress reports to the NIH. And some of the staff that worked in this, on this study with this investigator saw that the numbers reported were far greater than the number of informed consent documents that they had or the number of subjects that they had actually seen in the clinic, so they became suspicious about it. And in response to the concerns from the staff, this professor said that he had recruited subjects in other locations and that this staff didn't know about it because he had done that separately. The RIO determined during the assessment phase that this professor had reported far greater numbers of participants than could be verified through grant expenditures. So they actually went to their sponsored programs office, who keeps track of all the money that's spent on a grant, and they said it doesn't look like there were that many subjects that this professor reported. So an inquiry was initiated, and the professor refused to be interviewed during the inquiry. But he did claim that, I think he wrote in and said that there was, that the question reports were based on data gathered over a period of many years at other sites, and that much of the data were collected at clinical sites that no longer existed, so he couldn't go back to these sites and get any data. So an investigation was initiated. And at that point, this professor said, "I've had enough." And he left the university and he took a position at another university because the case was very private and confidential, so he just walked over to another university not far from the first and started working there. And at the same time, he sued in court to limit the scope of the investigation, so he was being very obstructive during this process that the first institution was working on, and he sued that institution. In this particular case, when it goes to federal court like that, they don't have a good understanding about all the facts, and they wound up siding with the respondent, and the case was limited in scope. Okay, so he claimed that the subject numbers in his studies were obtained from eligibility sheets and not from informed consent documents, and that's why the staff hadn't seen it, and it was based on the number of persons screened, not on persons enrolled. So he made up this kind of convoluted story about why the numbers were inconsistent. When the investigation committee was preparing its report, the committee chair told the professor that they were leaning toward a finding of research misconduct because it kind of rejected his argument of how he had gotten to those numbers of subjects that were involved. And at that point, this professor said, well, there are several former staff who worked with me that can attest to this and who could tell you that this is true. And this is the way we determine the subject numbers. So, and at the same time, there was a staff member who said that the RIO had tampered with the documents, and that's why they couldn't find it, because when the RIO was sequestering the evidence, it was the RIO who got rid of these consent forms and these other documents that would have cleared the professor. So he was being obstructive, and there was accusations against different people. So the investigation ultimately issued its report with a finding of no misconduct, because they really weren't able to parse apart who was telling the truth and who weren't, and they relied on some of this witness testimony that this other person said the RIO had done something. The strange thing about this case was that after a finding of no misconduct, this professor was so angry that he felt like he was forced to leave the first institution, that he filed a lawsuit against that institution for about $4 million in damages, because he said that he was he was forced to leave with no reason for it. And look, there was no misconduct finding. So because this was an institution in a state, it was a state institution, a public institution, the state attorney general, that office handled the case for the state where it occurred. So it actually went up to the legal system within the state. And they have resources to kind of look into it and to determine what was going on. And what they found out was that based on the testimony that they had gotten from witnesses that supported this professor's story, they determined that he had actually hired people to act as actors to be interviewed by phone, which is what the committee based their findings on, was the testimony of the witnesses. And he had hired these actors, and he told them that they were taking part in a role-playing exercise, and that they would be asked questions by a committee to see how well the committee does, and that really these actors should follow this script that he wrote for them. He told them that this was really just like a mock trial. So at the time that all of this was going on, just prior to this all breaking, there was a production company that was working with the Office of Research Integrity, ORI, and they were writing a script for these videos that ORI put out. And these people had no background in research. They were all like videographers and people in production. And they wrote this script, and the scientists in the office would read the script to see whether it was credible or not. Now, this story here with these actors, if they came up with this script, I would have said, that's ridiculous. You can't write that. That would never happen. That's a crazy story. So I always think about that, because I would try to make that script more believable and more credible from a scientific perspective, and yet you can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is actually real. This happened, and it's really hard to believe that somebody would hire actors to portray a witness role in an investigation, and that's exactly what he did. And it's not the only case, unfortunately. Anyway, eventually he was arrested and charged with attempted grand larceny because he was abusing federal funding from the grants, perjury, falsifying business records, and other crimes. And the state attorney said the charges in this case allege a pattern of lies and deceit that a public employee used to attempt to defraud the taxpayers. And sadly, shortly after that, he actually, we don't know, but there was no reports on it. They think he committed suicide. So this was a very troubled man who did very strange things, and it's really hard. Sometimes it's hard to believe that fact is even more unbelievable than fiction. This was a case. It was a researcher. It's all public information, so it's you could verify it. I'm not making it up. And basically, you cannot be too cautious. You know, in some of the training that ORI has done, it tells RIOs, if a witness comes into the room, make sure you verify who that person is. And I can remember looking at the faces of people in the audience, and they're, why would we do that? You do it because you can't believe what people will try to do to get away with something. Okay. It's 11:15, and there is a topic here on data sequestration, but I think maybe we'll leave that because yeah, that was the last topic in this. And I know that data is not sequestered here. I'll leave you with this, and I've said it already. Sequestering data is a very, very difficult task because people feel like they're being violated. You're taking something that belongs to me. The way that it's handled in the US is to make sure that the respondents know this is also for your protection. Because if a case is being handled you don't want anybody to be able to say that the respondent had access to the data and tampered with it, and that's why the university couldn't make a finding. You want to say, by holding on to this data, it's not because we think you're guilty, it's because we want to protect the process. And that's really the only way that you can deal with it and make people understand why you're doing it. It is part of the federal regulation, so it's part of the authority that the institutions have. As I mentioned, the data is actually owned by the institution, and that gives them the legal right to actually go in and say, we have to get it. But there are lots of challenges with sequestering data because of technology nowadays. Now, if you don't sequester data, your investigation is limited, and you can't really get to the conclusion of whether misconduct occurred or not, because in order to make that decision, you'd have to look at data. If you're relying on data that a respondent provides to you, look at what Professor Bill did. Bill lied about making up witnesses, so why not think that respondents will lie about giving data that supports them and doesn't damage them? So the whole issue of data sequestration is very complicated. In the US, it's mandatory, but if you don't sequester data, I guess you just have to try to do the best you can in order to handle these processes and deal with the research, whether misconduct occurred or not. So that's the conclusion of the first part. Are we ending at 12? Yeah, okay. So if you want, we could have a couple of minutes for questions, if you have any questions of this part. The afternoon, it will be more, less procedural and more dealing with some specific issues that arise in handling research misconduct and also other issues at institutions. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you for the talk. That's very I think important for us. And I think I would like to ask a question about what would be your the attitude or the procedures to deal with the questionable research practice.
Yeah.
I know for the misconduct we have thousands of the procedures, but how about the questionable research?
Yeah, so I'll talk about some of that this afternoon. In general, the office that handles compliance handles it based on the regulation. So that's all the research misconduct. So they don't handle things like authorship disputes or poor mentorship or really sloppy laboratory practices. But what we do is the allegation will come in, and if the issues have those kinds of problems, it's referred back to the college to deal with. So the dean of the college or whoever is the person that is the head of the college will find a way to deal with those kinds of things appropriate to the discipline that it is in. So if it's medical or if it's, you know, arts and sciences, it would just depend on what the issues were. But it would be handled by the dean.
Hi, I just have a question about interview. I'm just wondering, in what kind of circumstance would you consider to use interview as a tool to investigate the research misconduct?
It's actually part of the regulations, so every institution has to interview the respondent and usually the complainant.
So you use it very frequently?
All the time.
All the time.
All the time.
Thank you.
There's one, yeah, okay, hold on.
Use. So the responder will see all the committee members?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So in this case, in Taiwan, nobody wants to be on the committee.
Yeah. Well, and that's the case in the United States too, but people will do it. And, you know, to me, it reminds me of grant reviewers. So when you work at NIH, when you're a scientist. NIH gets all these grants, and they rely on the community to review all these grants and to make a determination of whether there will be funding or not. And the people who do this, they may get their expenses covered to come to a study section to review the grants from the government, but they don't get anything else. And every faculty member will say, I have to go, I have to review the grants, and they don't like doing it, but everybody does it because they feel it's their duty to do it. They feel it's part of the scientific community and what you need. And I think that this research misconduct and sitting on a committee, nobody wants to do it. And when they get on the committee and they see how much work there is, they really don't want to do it. But they feel like it's part of a commitment to make this community better. And actually there are some very good committees that I've seen, that I know about, that will work really, really hard and really well because they get invested in the whole process and they want to see it to completion. Sometimes the inquiries go on so long because the committee just can't let go. The inquiry is only supposed to decide, is there enough to move to an investigation and let the investigation committee deal with it? But those inquiry committees, they are scientists and they want to know what the answer is in the end, so they keep going, or sometimes too long. So I think that the more cases you have, the more people are aware of the consequences of research misconduct, the more they might feel like this is part of their duty to do it. And I don't know, they just do it. I guess, we're lucky that people do have that commitment. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Does the office receive the allegation against the students' publication if the misconduct allegation is against the students' publications?
Yeah, it can be against anything. In fact, there is no, the research record is defined in the federal regulation. And even if there's falsification or fabrication in a research record, if nothing is published, there could be a finding of research misconduct. We had, in ORI, there was a case of somebody who was doing an analysis, and there were electronic records that documented the analysis that she was doing. And as it turned out, there was an entire record with, it was a specific technology that she was using, and there was an entire record with file names and dates that documented these experiments over, I don't know, 5-6 years, something like that. And in the end, it turned out she had used one file and duplicated it that many times and just named it something differently and saved it at different times. She had never done any experiment. And there was a research misconduct finding made on that case because there was falsification of the research record. Nothing was published. So it could be a student's thesis, it could be a notebook, it could be a publication. There's a lot of parts of a research record, and a misconduct finding can be made on anything. Yeah.
Susan, I'm interested in the scope of the investigation. So if an allegation points to one paper, and during the investigation, more papers and more people gets implicated, do you draw a line? How do you define the scope? Yeah. And if a person moves from institution A to B to C, and he has problem with the work he has done during in B, does institution A and C automatically try to investigate what he has done during those times?
Well, I wish I could just give you an answer that was easy, but that's not an easy answer. So for the scope, the regulation actually says if the scope is broadened during the inquiry or investigation, the committee is obligated to look at the full scope of the problem. So because that's the way it's written, I would get calls when I worked at ORI from RIOs who were handling these cases, and one RIO called me and said this is a case of the investigator took pictures of cells and had thousands and thousands of these experiments and the pictures from these cells. And she said, how do I know when I've looked at the full scope? You know, how far back do I go? What do I do? And this is a perfect example of using discretion. So if you look at a certain amount of work and you see that it's accurate, you don't need to go look back at more. If you look at what the allegations are all about and look a little bit more, like around that same time frame, were there any other problems with the work, then that's probably sufficient. It's really on a case-by-case basis. You kind of, when you deal with these cases, you get to the feeling of knowing whether you think that this is a more isolated incident or this really is something that goes back 20 years. Because we do have cases where the investigator had problems with published work over, 15 or 20 years. So when is enough enough? I mean, there really is no good answer. Theoretically, you're supposed to look at everything. But practically, when enough is enough, when if you look at more, it's not going to have any effect on what the outcome is. So there's no way to really measure that. You just have a sense of when you think this really is enough. So if an investigator has 10 papers that are at issue, there might be 11 papers, but is it going to make any difference on the scope on the outcome and the action that's taken? Probably not. So you kind of limit it based on all the facts of the case. And that's the best way I could answer that. In terms of institutions collaborating with one another, I mean, it really is dependent, again, on the facts of the case, where the data is. As I said, the reasonable way to handle it is that the institution where the misconduct occurred is the institution that it has the obligation to look at the data and do the investigation. But we had a situation where there was a case where the data was generated at an institution and then the PI left, but the people who were generating the data stayed at that institution. And there was a lot of communication between the PI and the other people during the time when the paper was getting published. So which institution actually had the jurisdiction? The one where the PI was currently, or the one where the data was actually generated? As it turned out, that interaction between the PI and the staff, it was during that time period that the falsification actually occurred, while the PI was at the other institution, at the new institution. So the way they handled that case was that the new institution took over the investigation because that's where the misconduct occurred, despite the fact that the original data was generated at the older institution. So you kind of, either institution could have asserted jurisdiction and said that, the data was generated here, so we're going to take control. But I think each institution would like the other one to handle it anyway. So it's really on a case-by-case basis. You look, it seems, at what seems to be the most efficient way to do it.
Any other question? I have a question. I know the anonymous allegation is universal, as I know of. But there's an argument from some researchers in Taiwan. They say we should not accept anonymous. They compare that to the sexual harassment. So what's your reaction on that?
Well, we've talked a little bit about this. I mean, I think that when it's sexual harassment, you have one story and another story, and usually the case is weighed by testimony from one witness and another witness. And there isn't a whole lot more that you could look for. You're looking at what they're saying and what they claim to be true, unless there are, some kind of abuse, which is a whole different issue. in research misconduct, that's only part of the story. So you have one person saying that I didn't do it, one person saying that yes, you did do it. If you don't know who the complainant is, it really doesn't matter, because you could still look at the data to make an assessment about whether misconduct occurred. Is the data accurate? Does it look to be falsified? You could talk to a complainant or not. If you don't have enough information to make that assessment, then you have to talk to the complainant, then you have to dismiss the allegation. But if you have enough information to actually move forward and look to see if the data is falsified or not, then you could actually move forward and you don't need the testimony of a complainant. I think that what drives complainants to raise allegation varies depending on who it is, and allowing anonymity is a way to make people who are vulnerable feel like they could raise an allegation. So, I mean, I think it's a good idea to look at every allegation that comes in and see if there's any merit, regardless of how it comes in. But I don't know why people wouldn't want to do it. If it's a bad faith allegation and somebody's doing it to seek revenge on something, you find out that pretty quickly, because people who make bad faith allegations, usually the data is there to support the work in question. And if the data is there to support the work, the allegation goes away. So I hope that I'll see most of your faces this afternoon. This was a little bit dry, I know, because it was very procedural, but I hope that I will see you, and thank you very much.